Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm not too sure if the poll is still up again because I think it might have been interrupted with the changing there and the re-recording, and that's okay. I think I remember most of the data in terms of the questions. Oh, there it is again, in case you haven't been able to fill that out quite yet. We just wanted to know a little bit about who we were talking to in terms of the tracks, but it looks like we have a kind of a half and half in terms of those of you being online who are really seeking to learn a little bit more about potentially switching academic tracks for yourself or how you should be advising your peers about switching tracks. So I think that our content will fulfill that. Give me just a second. And I wanted to also acknowledge Dr. Moreno's participation in the drafting of these slides and the content, as well as my Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs and Career Development at the University of Arizona College of Medicine, Phoenix, and that is Ken Knox, who also helped sort of think through some of the case scenarios that we're going to chat through. So the objectives of this session, as per the program, are to just go over what factors might influence one's decision to change academic tracks, and the other will go over the risks and the benefits of switching tracks. And I just wanted to open with a few reminders on what I think are the top 3 musts in terms of resources as you're thinking through this or seeking to advise somebody about switching tracks. But the first one here to the left side of your screen, Dr. Laura Roberts has a very nice comprehensive chapter. I think it's actually chapter number 24 in the Roberts Academic Medicine Handbook that kind of takes people through exactly what we're going to go over today in terms of the pros and cons of changing academic tracks and aligning your tracks with your strengths and your assigned roles with your institution. Also, don't forget to mute until we get started on the discussion, okay? And then the other book is called The Promotion Game. It is an easy read. It's easy to understand. I remember having this book and referring to it during my own promotion process. I was recently promoted to associate professor, and I utilized this book in a program, a faculty development program, when I was at the College of Medicine, Tucson, with Dr. Moreno and our Dean for Faculty Affairs, Ann Wright. And it was very, very helpful in terms of planning out over the course of 6 to 7 years how I was going to achieve the criteria within my track. And I'm on an educator track in medicine. But I think the most important piece of documentation you need to refer to is your specific guidelines, because when one knows their guidelines at their institution, that's the only guidelines that they know. So don't forget to mute.
Mais en général, les changements sont
sorry. And thank you. And so your university will have your own specific guidelines as approved in your bylaws.
I'm sorry, Doctor. Whoever is on, can you please mute yourself?
I'm sorry, I keep hearing a background talk. Is it okay to proceed?
Yeah, you have all the power to silence us.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of hard to do as I'm navigating the slides. Thank you. So as I was saying, there's several different tracks, and I wanted to go through some of the possible language that you might be hearing. This is particularly relevant is if you have folks coming in and transferring from your institution. But in general, everyone has their own specific terms, but these 4 are the general tracks that are available for faculty. So the first, you might hear it referred to as a clinical educator or educator scholar. And this might be a track where MDs, DOs, PhDs, EDDs might be in if they have a rather significant amount of teaching responsibilities built in with the other pieces of their mission. So the next track would be a clinical researcher or perhaps a research scholar. In this track, you would have MDs, DOs, or PhDs who have the vast majority of time dedicated to clinical research, basic science research, maybe even medical education research. And so these are mostly physician investigator type of a track here. The next track that one might hear is primary clinician. Some institutions still refer to it as a master clinician. And here, the vast majority of time would be dedicated to patient care mission. They might have some additional responsibilities with teaching and maybe some research. And the research might look more like QI. That's a bit embedded into their clinical responsibilities. But for their major identity is seeing patients. And then the fourth track, I would say, is mostly relevant for MDs and PhDs who are in a traditional tenure track. These tracks are shrinking nationally and becoming less and less available, but they're still there. I do see that we have a few participants that actually are on a tenure track. And so this talk will be addressing some of those. And so just to sort of sensitize you, if you don't already know some of this language, and again, it might be referred to a little bit differently at your institution, but what we call the distribution of efforts or a workload statement, or maybe it's your clinical contract or university contract, those contracts should have exactly the title, a distribution of your efforts across the mission. So if you look at your far left of your screen, and as I had started with the primary clinician or the master clinician, you would see the vast majority of their percent effort or their FTE, their full-time equivalency time, is mostly dedicated to patient care. Then you would see the orange in education, as I mentioned before, some teaching responsibilities with potentially a smattering of research that might look like patient safety QI projects. The next track is the clinical educator track. You see sort of a bit more of a balance in terms of the expectation and how much time should be dedicated to the three missions. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to tear out the clinical service with the education piece because most of the time as physicians, you will have a trainee with you on your service line. And so you kind of get a 2-for-1 there, if you will, but there still is that expectation of educational research or clinical research as part of your duties. And then finally, particularly for physicians and basic scientists, and those sort of on the tenure track as well, you see the complete inverse of the primary clinician expectation. Most of that time is going to be dedicated to investigative efforts with a smattering of education and a little bit of clinical service in terms of contributing to your division productivity targets. So the reason I bring that up, the workload up, is because that is really what's going to ground the request and the rationale behind asking for a switch. When you ask for a switch, at most institutions, this is not a routine exercise. It's not an everyday thing that administration really sort of manages. So it's rare, far and few between. Generally, this will be part of a discussion in your annual performance review or your mid-cycle review if you're on the tenure track. And so primarily this is done to address significant changes in your interests or in your roles, or maybe the department's roles or your division's roles, or all three of them. And the way the processes around switching tracks is going to vary widely depending on your institution. There's no one way or right way to get through that process because the university systems, your college or your faculty affairs office and your provost work together to set these policies. And normally it's then facilitated by your department chair or your chief. And in some instances, it will need approval by a promotion and tenure committee within your department and the faculty affairs office, and ultimately your dean. So a little bit about, it's hard to see my screen here, sorry. A little bit about why you might want to do this. Again, it's done in the spirit of aligning your roles And that visual that I just shared, aligning that distribution of effort, your time, with really what you're doing. And it should align with your professional identity. So if you really, really love teaching and you like being embedded in the day-to-day with the residents and the fellows, that might be a time when you're saying, yeah, my educator track is appropriate for me. This is where I want to be. So you shouldn't really have an FTE that is dedicating the vast majority of your time onto clinical service or doing a lot of research. And by a lot, I mean anything over 50% of research. So some possible influences, again, is maybe a change in interest. Maybe you came in thinking you want to do a bit more clinical investigation, and you maybe have just lost passion for it. Or maybe you've found a new passion with teaching the students and residents, and that is the direction you want to go in. Another possible influence is changing in your own role. So perhaps this might be a little bit out of your control, but perhaps in your department, there's just some different target demands in terms of productivity that are now affecting your division. And so there might be some call for you to serve in an administrative role, maybe a clerkship director or a residency director or service line director, that's going to change that distribution of efforts for you dramatically. I think that's the key word, is dramatic and significant change in where your effort is going to be on, according to the mission. And again, the impetus of having this discussion with mentors or your department chairs and self-reflection is really going to come at the time of your performance reviews, and sort of hashing out that discussion and getting clarity and purpose in your career direction with your mentors. And so a few people that must be involved, we thought, in this discussion are obviously your immediate supervisor, who we anticipate would be your department chair or your division chief, depending on the specialty you're sort of sitting in. We strongly recommend that you bounce these ideas off from your mentors. It's really good practice to have several mentors. We don't really have one sort of holy grail mentor who might have all the answers and be the be all end all for us. So bounce those ideas off several trusted mentors and sponsors. Also, some of you who are clinicians in particular might have some additional roles. You have a division chief as your primary boss, but then maybe you're an associate program director for a fellowship. And that program director might also want to know what your goals are. This sort of goes back to our beginning discussion at this conference about making your needs and your wants and where you want to go and the position you want to be at known to others. So this is a good time to inform them of that and bounce ideas off of them as well. So that starts to create a community of people who are well informed about what your strengths are and where you want to go, and they can better advise you on how to get there. Some optional folks to keep in mind: if you're at a school that is early on in their accreditation, and a young school, and I would say young is anything that is less than 10 years into LCME accreditation, you may not have exactly that frontline defense to go to a division chief or a department chair. And sometimes deans of faculty affairs and career development are leaned on a bit more. And so don't be afraid. I would encourage you to also reach out to your associate deans for faculty affairs and professional development to gain some of their insight onto whether this decision would be feasible, and review your workload with you, and also discuss how much time it might take and the exact procedures at your institution. Also, for those of you, I know there's a few of you on the call, if you are on the tenure track or tenure eligible track, some of that discussion is pretty closely tied to some financing there. So you want to elevate your discussion after you talk with your department chair to faculty affairs, and so that they can then elevate it to the Board of Regents and the Dean and the Finance Office, sort of depending on your case. So the benefits of switching tracks is that it allows you to better align yourself in terms of timing and actually being successful in your promotion on your track. It helps you iron out the balance between your distribution of efforts, again, how much time you have in each of the mission according to the promotion criteria at your institution. So that is a very important benefit of it. And then lastly, I think when you're making that switch and you feel like you have a closer identity and a better fit with that particular track and title, it also gives some type of external symbolic capital to those that are outside of your institution. When I see that someone is a clinician, a clinical scholar, or educator scholar, some of these terms might vary depending on your school. Immediately, it tells me a little bit about them and where their strengths are. And I can anticipate where their expertise is at, such that I can invite them to participate in more appropriate committees and give them appropriate tasks that they will find professionally meaningful and will also move the needle forward for promotion for them. And so some of the risks around it, kind of depending on the organizational culture. At some places, this might be a stigma, and other places, it's not. I get the sense that at maybe higher tier type medical schools, maybe Johns Hopkins, Stanford, this might be a stigma, but and this also varies between specialties. Internal medicine may not see this as a big deal, but OBGYN does see it as a big deal. But people kind of get a little nervous about modifiers with their titles. And so what do I mean by modifier is that when we have a modifier that says specifically that they're clinical first, it starts with the word clinical. That tells me that your investment and your energy in your track leans more towards patient care. And sometimes people perceive it that there's less commitment or seriousness to scholarship and teaching, that the rigor, that the bar for promotion might be a bit easier for them. So whether that's true or not will depend on the individual and their CV and their accomplishments, of course. But that is the general perception that is sort of floating out there that faculty get a little nervous about in terms of what does that communicate or say about me when I'm thinking about how serious or competitive I am as a scholar. Additionally, when you're advising folks about changing tracks, because they are switching and now looking at a different set of promotion criteria, and let's just say they haven't exactly met that criteria, it will likely extend how much time and rank that they're spending before they can actually go up for promotion in that new track. And some schools require that when people switch tracks, they must stay in that track 2 to 3 years before attempting promotion. And some schools have no time at all. So again, that is all relevant and dependent upon the faculty affairs policies at your School of Medicine. So let's get to the good stuff, some of the discussion here on the cases. So in our first case, I have Dr. De Silva here. And I just want you to jump in and chime in and tell me how you would advise this person if you were a department chair or if you were a dean of faculty affairs, or just as a role as a mentor and a trusted advisor. What would you recommend he sort of think about, think through, or do? So I'm going to give you some points here about Dr. De Silva. So currently, this physician is on a non-tenure eligible academic clinician track. And that's just the random title that I'm going to assign at this time. So what does academic clinician mean? That means someone who is focused on heavily on the educational mission and is really churning out some educational scholarship and scholarship of teaching. So his promotion criteria emphasizes exactly what I just said, an expectation of educational scholarship and leadership. He's also the service line director for the adult medicine ICU at his hospital. And he's in pulmonary critical care. And they have had some changes in that division where the academic division is shrinking in terms of the number of faculty. There's been some attrition there. And even though there's been attrition, the clinical productivity expectation is not decreasing. So he has had to pick up additional consult service and shifts that have been added to the schedule for the last 2 years. And so now Dr. De Silva is really functioning at about 85% in terms of clinical time, which is not really in alignment with how he first started in his distribution of efforts. So now we're at the 7-year mark of him at the assistant professor rank, and he really can't get a handle on meeting the traditional scholarly requirements, i.e. publications, conference podium presentations, and an educational leadership position. But the clinical exposure and the contributions that he has now made in terms of creating new clinical protocols and thriving with the new demands on the clinical end, he's actually excelling in what one could think of as a clinical series track. So someone who's focused more on clinical service. So you're sitting with Dr. De Silva at his annual review, and he's considering switching to the clinical track that emphasizes clinical excellence and patient care. What would you advise him? What would that discussion and discourse around encouragement be for Dr. De Silva if you were a chair? You can go ahead and type in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
I know you were mentioning where his new roles have focused in the clinical space. I just wanted to ask, I think it would also be important to ask Dr. De Silva whether he is enjoying that new shift in his work. I know he has had to pick up a lot of these roles and focused clinical service needs because of the demanding needs of the clinical work. But as long as I think there's a difference between whether there is a alignment in terms of desire or alignment in terms of what track requirements or expectations might be.
So what about money? You know, I do not know if Dr. Silva knows if he's going to earn less or more money if he switch tracks. That might be a point for him to consider.
So what about, let's go first to Rena's point, which goes to one of our initial slides about a change in interest. So what if De Silva says, I'm loving it. I thought I want to do a little bit more teaching, but I've always got a learner with me, so I'm sensitized to it. I kind of know what's going on with the medical school, but I really love the time I spend on wards with the families, getting to know with the families. I'm treating them as well. I like the patient engagement. What would you advise first based on passion?
That would give me a lot more confidence, because then it would be an advice to look into the switching to a clinical track and the logistics for doing so, understanding all the risks and benefits along the way. But it's rooted in, the decision would be rooted in his interests, his passion, but also what the shift has been in terms of his focused, professional work.
And I think
may I also offer a question?
Sure.
Please go ahead.
I think it's important also to know how long it's going to take him to move up the ladder as well. So if he switches the track, he may just be at the point right now that he will remain in the same title for an additional 4 or 5 years. And that may not necessarily be attractive, to him if he has to now wait an additional 5-6 years to move to, from the clinical assistant professor to associate professor.
Yes, that's a really good point. And sometimes, I've had that situation come up before, and just given our policies, Sometimes you can go up for promotion if you want on the track that you're at and see what happens and then switch, or vice versa. Yeah, maybe take the hit. It depends on where that faculty member's sort of headspace is at and what their values are. It might be okay. You might say, no, this is in alignment. This is where I want to be. It's fine. If I'm another 4 years at rank, okay. However, again, it will depend on the body of that person's work and how much clinical excellence they're demonstrating over a certain period of time compared to your school's criteria. That's a really good point to get them to think. Are you willing to extend that time? Dr. Moreno, I think you had a question as well.
Having
No?
some trouble with connection. Can you guys hear me okay? No?
Yes.
Okay. I sent some questions to you via the chat in case we get cut off. But a lot of very important thoughts that people are sharing. Some, whether switch.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time. You're sort of frozen here, but I'll read the questions out from the chat. And so Dr. Moreno brings up the point, what about the priorities for the college and the department? And would that changing tracks limit career aspirations potentially? What are your thoughts on that? Anyone?
Well, I think that there is an important point here because everything, to me looks unpredictable here, even though if I am the dean, because at this point, if the academic division is shrinking, that's a big thing, meaning that nobody knows if they are going to continue having this path or not. So this is unpredictable. I think that looking at the in the near future, I think if I am the dean and I know exactly what is going to happen with my department, and taking in account that he has been basically 7 years not producing anything in the academic rank, I would suggest him to switch to the clinical track. But it is unpredictable, and the only person who can make that decision is the dean, because he's the only one who knows where the department goes to. Both in the...
Can he make the decision on the priorities of what's going on with the department? Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of dynamics and uncertainty. Dr. Acosta.
And also it'll be interesting to know if the reason why the other clinicians left were because they couldn't meet, there wasn't enough research. They couldn't just get a handle on productivity as well. So they just rather jump ship because there's no support than just to hang around. So it varies as well.
Yes. And also let's get back to that point that Arnold mentioned about finances, about money. So financially, what's in it for me? At least at our school, the track is not the determinant of the salary. It's rank and specialty, AAMC tables, and potentially some other incentives with our corporate partners. We've had an acquisition and merger. So anyone else have other experiences or questions about how financial arrangements may or may not be relevant with track switching and impacting their career aspirations?
I had a question to address that. So at our institution, the startup packages are where you see the biggest variability between the various different tracks. And so at the time of committing to a particular track, that's where the discrepancies might be. But in theory, it's really to align with the needs of that particular individual. So let's just say on a clinical track, the hiring package might be more relevant to the clinical support team members to accomplish the clinical work. Whereas on the research track, it might be the research, component and of the startup package, not so much the base salary. I think that's where, just like you just mentioned, Lou, I think there's a more of a scale, based on rank and time within rank rather than track. But I was curious to know, since we're talking about track switching, what happens in that circumstance where there's a potential for a track switch? Would there be a startup package offered in, that might vary, or?
Yeah, I think that would vary, but by your dean. I think that's probably more than likely not going to happen because it's not a startup. It's your choice to be switching. And generally the institution's commitment is to what they initially offered you. And so now sort of the rules of the game are switching midway because of your sort of your own reasons coupled with some divisional changes. But I would say that that's highly unlikely to happen, to have another startup because you're switching. I have not, in my experience, and if anyone else here on the line has had the experience of salary changing, either higher or lower because of a track switch, I have not seen that. Again, at least for our institution, the policies do not call for a change in salary or stipends. The stipend might come into play if, let's just say,
I have seen that.
If you're switching roles, maybe to an educator role or an administrative role, and that track will call for additional leadership, and then you might get a stipend. That might be a scenario. Francisco, if you're able to chime in, you were saying that you have seen something like that, a change in salary.
Yeah, so it's not exactly a change in salary based on a switch in tracks, but we had differential salaries for individuals that were being hired to do specific kinds of work. And those that were primarily clinicians designated to work in our crisis center or inpatient units received a different stipend than those of us that came under a different sort of set of expectations. And that's something that, as you mentioned in the University of Arizona system, is now a lot more standardized, but there's a whole lot of variability, and most institutions have a lot of variability in terms of what track people end up in. Yeah.
In one instance, I had actually that I was applying for a job, and they actually told me that whatever I work in emergency medicine, so I would get a package, let's say, $250 from the institution, but whatever I would work outside in the emergency department would come to the institution. So I would end up losing money. So, if you're making 200, 300,000 outside, moonlighting, they do pay $250 an hour. It's a big deal for somebody, that could be a deal breaker if the institution is just paying you this much, but they also want you to work on the outside to make sure that you mentor the students. But it's not attractive to lose that money. So it depends, how your contract is written up.
Really good point. Okay, we're almost at time, and I did want to make a little bit of time for any additional questions that might be not related to our discussion. We did have one more case discussion, but I want to appreciate everyone's time. But in general, I think our takeaway point for everyone here, whether you're thinking about switching a track or you're in the position of advising others in terms of their contemplation, is you actually want to get it done right the first time with their onboarding and just even the recruitment process, helping folks identify their strengths and aligning with the appropriate role. If that doesn't happen, you want to encourage switching mostly based on their own passion, interests, these points that Raina was bringing up and Arnold, and what will match with the changing landscape of the division and the department. So if you don't have tracks that align with maybe your primary administrative piece, you want to create it, start pioneering other tracks that could be made available to others at your institution if they don't already exist. Stand up and have that discussion with the chair and the faculty affairs deans for that possibility. So as we close here, I'm going to stop sharing, and I just wanted to make some time for any additional questions.
And as people come in, I hope you are able to hear me. I'm in a beach town in Mexico, so the Wi-Fi here is not the greatest, but I'm just very thankful for Dr. Federico Martinez for agreeing to share of your experiences and expertise and all the knowledge you have in this area. Thanks so much. Did you have resources that you wanted to share with folks as well? And if they have questions, can they email you, email us? What can we tell us as we say goodbye?
Yes, I'm going to pop in my email at the bottom of the chat. I went through the resources at the beginning, but I do believe everybody will have copies of the PowerPoint that has some additional resources, about 3 or 4 more slides afterwards, that you can go to and look. Yeah, so I'm just going to pop in my email and Dr. Moreno's email as well, and you'll have our PowerPoint.
That is great. Well, we thank you again, Dr. Martinez, and everybody who made some time to join us here today. We appreciate your interest and your engagement. And with that, I think we close our session. Thank you all very much again.
Thank you.